It's really nice to see everyone. I am Bruce Grant from anthropology here at NYU. It's terrific to see so many familiar faces and names on the screen, and I hope you'll all join me in welcoming our speaker today, the wonderful Claire Kaiser, who sadly we could not bring up to New York proper, for a talk and so on at the same time. It also means that we get to see each other a little better than at funny angles on screens in the Jordan Center room. I'd like just to take a few moments just to introduce today's guest. This is really in part a celebration of a terrific book coming out. Claire will give a presentation, and then of course we'll have time for discussion and questions. Without further ado then, Claire Kaiser, also on the screen to the next of me, currently is teaching on the side in her educational profile at Georgetown University Center for Eurasian, Russian, and Eastern European Studies. But her day job, among her many hats that she wears, is as head of strategy for McClarty Associates, a Washington-based global strategy firm. For those of you who have not yet met Claire or know of her work, she earned her bachelor's degree in foreign service and an MA in Eurasian, Russian, and Eastern European studies, both from Georgetown University. She went on to do a superb dissertation in modern Russian and Soviet history at the University of Pennsylvania. Alongside her research and publishing, Claire has played many roles. She began her career actually at the US Embassy in Kiev, no doubt making it all the harder to follow events of today. She has been an instructor at the Department of State's Foreign Service Institute. She served as an election observer for the OSCE in a number of places: Azerbaijan, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and so forth. But what really brings us here today, at least to get our discussion going, is this great book, which I'm delighted to have in my hands, Georgian and Soviet, entitled Nationhood and the Specter of Stalin in the Caucasus. I hope that we'll have a chance in the discussion today to really appreciate what an incredibly nuanced take this gives, not only on nationality relations in the USSR in the post-war period, which is always so perennially understudied in that context, but also what it says about the Caucasus, the USSR more broadly. It's really just a terrific piece of work. I will try not to go on too long because I'm not the person people came to hear, but it's a terrific piece of work. So I'm going to turn things over to Claire, and thank you everyone for coming.
Well, thank you so much, Bruce, for the kind introduction and really for your support of this project, from the very, very early days. So it's wonderful to have it out into the world now and be able to introduce it to you all today. Believe it or not, I think this is actually my first fully virtual event, even though I've done a lot of book talks in the past couple of months. So hopefully the technology, works as it should. And first step, we shall see if my presentation shares effectively. So let's share screen now. Great. All right. So on March 9th, tens of thousands of Georgians had been demonstrating for days against a perceived Moscow-driven policy against Georgia and Georgians in Tbilisi, as well as in other cities. Demonstrators had a range of demands and no clear leader. Georgian authorities were struggling to manage the escalating situation on the streets. And so just after midnight on March 9th, the military intervened, killing dozens of demonstrators. So until that final sentence, I very easily could have been talking about March 9th just a month ago, as opposed to March 9th, 1956, which is really a formative date in Georgian history in the Soviet period, but also for my book. It lies squarely in the middle of my chapters. In chapter 4, I have a whole chapter devoted to it. And in terms of Georgia's Soviet development and its kind of national trajectory in that 70-year period, this really is an essential sort of frame of reference to have in mind. So on March 9th, 1956, as I said, Soviet troops violently suppressed what had been demonstrations that really took over the entire Georgian SSR over the past 4 days. This was immediately in response to some rumors that began circulating after the secret speech, which Khrushchev had given in Moscow, in late February. which of course said any number of things regarding Stalin, the Stalinist system, and various crimes that had been committed, laying the blame squarely on Stalin. Of course, this was a secret speech that didn't say secret all too long, but because there weren't texts circulating at that point, the rumor that got back to Georgia pretty quickly after the speech itself was delivered at the 20th Party Congress was that Khrushchev had said some things about Stalin that denigrated him very specifically as a Georgian figure, which nevertheless did not sit very well with his countrymen in Georgia proper. So people began to gather at the Stalin monument, which you see in the background of this picture, on the banks of the Mtvari River in Tbilisi on March 5th, which was the 3rd anniversary of Stalin's death, much as they had done the previous couple of years. This time, of course, they weren't technically supposed to do that since Khrushchev's campaign against the Stalinist cult of personality had just been launched, even if not with the clearest initial rollout. And so very quickly, these demonstrations evolved from being, a memorial for Stalin to, really viewing Khrushchev's pronouncements at the 20th Party Congress to be, a specific sort of, attack against Stalin as a Georgian and as a national figure. And so you see, this very kind of organic and rapid evolution of demonstrations that completely shut down Tbilisi, but also spread across the Republic. Something that the Georgian Republic leadership really struggled to respond to, not to mention Moscow. So the violent suppression of these demonstrations, which led to a couple of dozen people being killed, several dozen more wounded, largely young people. This becomes a real point of rupture and reconsideration of how Georgia fit into the broader sort of Soviet experiment in that period. And we see then how kind of in the aftermath of these demonstrations in 1956 and the subsequent crackdown, how Georgians and Georgia began to renegotiate their membership in the Soviet collective, and in particular, what role Stalin played and the Stalin cult played in the construction of a modern sense of Georgian nationhood. So this is really kind of the key entry point for my book, as I mentioned. And I think just as a point to sort of show how it's been memorialized subsequently, on the right-hand side of this screen is the really tiny plaque that commemorates this moment that's in downtown Tbilisi today. This was put up at some point during the, I think, early presidency of Mikhail Saakashvili. And in English and in Georgian, it simply says, "This monument commemorates the participants of a peaceful rally gunned down by the Soviet regime on March 9th, 1956. Factually accurate, but also really skipping over some important details about why demonstrators were in the streets in the first place, and what that has meant subsequently. Compared to other sort of monuments to Georgian demonstrators who were met with violence by the Soviet government at various points. This one is not really a site of commemoration where you would find flowers and that sort of thing on March 9th. It is very easy to miss, shall we say. So this is a good kind of point of departure for my book and its key questions. So as the title suggests, I'm very interested in exploring what it meant to be Georgian and Soviet, not Georgian or Soviet. And I think that the "and" is actually doing quite a bit of analytical work in the book. I think for Georgia, as well as many other non-Russian republics of the Soviet Union, there has been a bit of an assumption, perhaps given the post-Soviet trajectories of some of these countries, that the Soviet experience was one that was directly in opposition to local forces. It was simply a period of violence, occupation, and resistance in the case of some of these populations. Rather than kind of looking at that story, which I think has a fairly developed historiography at this point, as well as political trajectory, I was interested much more in how Georgians understood, engaged with, and leveraged the Soviet institutional system of nation building. This was something that was, enormously complex, enormously deep, and something that the Soviet state invested considerable resources in, not just in the 20s and 30s, but over the duration of the Soviet period, which in Georgia's case lasted 70 years. And so looking at really that constitutive element of Soviet institutional nation building and how Georgians interacted with and kind of pushed the bounds of that at various points. And then secondly, because Stalin himself is from Georgia, one of the reasons why I initially sort of wanted to investigate Georgia as a case study of Soviet nationality policies was the extent to which Stalin, the man, the network, and the cult, what impact this broader sort of enterprise had on his homeland and the populations that lived within it. So this isn't necessarily just about Stalin's personal relationships with Georgia and Georgians, but the broader contours of what how that relationship changed over time, and that story that continues to, I think, to sort of unfold in Georgian politics today. And then finally, something that was very important to me as I set out doing this project really a decade ago was trying to shift the vantage point of a history of the Soviet Union away from Moscow-centric narratives. So really looking at how the story changes when leading with voices and sources, in particular from Georgia, including many sources in Georgian, but not exclusively so, of course. And so just to kind of recap, the book's primary interventions, first of all, are looking at the post-war. This is something that, as the 1956 opener suggests, this was a formative period for nation building and national development in Soviet Georgia, and not only in Soviet Georgia. I think there's an assumption, again, in the historiography to date, that there was a lot of nation building work happening in the 20s and 30s. Then the war happens, and then we kind of jumped to 1985, assuming that there wasn't a whole lot of room for change, experimentation, that sort of thing, at least on the nationality policy front, because there wasn't necessarily the same level of, I think, top-down, policy direction in that regard. But that doesn't mean that, what was happening at the local level doesn't deserve to be studied. And, in the post-war period, in particular for Georgia, we see some really, remarkable and interesting developments that I think, are worth looking at. Second, this Stalin nexus that I alluded to previously. And I think that this shows, on the one hand, why Georgia was exceptional in many ways, given that Georgians and Georgia had this peculiar kind of link to Moscow in the person of Stalin, but also the broader and more complicated legacy with a nationalized Stalin cult. But also, on the other hand, because Stalin, again, as a child of empire, as a student of the Caucasus, and Georgian nationalist in his youth, clearly paid an outsized attention to Georgia and to the Caucasus, even as he ascended to power in Moscow. And so the way that he was viewing Georgia, Georgians, but also the broader region as he was making decisions that had a broader, I think, purchase throughout the USSR, whether it was in the ethno-territorial map, whether it was the relationship between, language, territory, passport, nationality, and all these sorts of things would really become kind of the bread and butter for how the whole system was constructed and, implemented over the entire period of Soviet history. Stalin, it's hard to separate him from that process. And I think his Georgian past and Georgian, familiarity is worth probing, and that's something that I do. Third, the book really tries to look at the extent to which the Soviet Union was an empire internally, not looking at the Warsaw Pact or something, which I think is, much more uncomplicated in viewing in imperial terms. But, I think looking kind of through the lens of Jane Burbank and Frederick Cooper's sort of analytical approach to empire as a means of managing difference, and kind of testing that over the course of the Soviet period using the Georgian case study, and showing how the Soviet Union could behave imperially at times, but also pursue nationalizing policies that locals could harness kind of for their own ends at various points. So trying to tease that change over time story out over the course of the book. And then finally, sources. As I said, the vast majority of the research for this book was conducted in Georgia, Georgian-based archives, and so with Georgian language sources as well. And that there are, several, maybe not several, there are fantastic monographs that have come out, I would say, in the past decade or so that have started to tap into the potential of Georgian archives, but we're still very much at the starting point of utilizing some of those sources. I'm thinking of, Eric Scott's work, Tim Blauvelt, Stephen Jones, and others. So we're starting to get a kind of critical mass of good Georgian sourced work. But there's much more where that could come from. So hopefully, more to come in that front. Next slide. Just to situate the Georgian SSR very, very briefly, I think it will not be entirely necessary with this group, but just quickly to get everybody on the same page. Georgia was the Democratic Republic of Georgia was invaded by the Bolshevik Red Army in February of 1921. So it actually had to be, conquered from a military in order to come into the Soviet fold. As the ethno-territorial map was being drawn, Georgia acquired 3 autonomous areas within it that, of course, ended up having important, I think, post-Soviet trajectories: Abkhazia, Adjara, and South Ossetia. I think in the book, I probably focus most on Abkhazia, but the others, get some treatment as well. Over the course of Georgia's 70-year Soviet experiment, ethnic Georgians comprise between 60 and 70% of the population. So, a healthy majority on the one hand, but it's not as homogenous of a republic population as, for example, Georgia's neighbor to the south, Armenia. Significant minorities in the republic, including Russians, of course, Azerbaijanis, Armenians, Greeks, Ossetians, Abkhaz, Kurds, you name it. So this gets at the, I guess, nationalizing aspirations of the majority population, but in places that sometimes was unevenly distributed, particularly in urban areas and in border regions, which is something that several of the chapters deal with. Georgia, as is perhaps obvious, was one of the smallest Soviet republics, so less than 2% of the all-union population at various points. But of course, one that I would say kind of punched above its weight in terms of not only in political influence, but also kind of just cultural impact, whether it was Georgian cuisine, Georgian dance, Georgian music, Georgian wine. They had a lot of sort of cultural products that were, of course, extremely well known, not just within the Soviet Union, but also abroad. And so that took a relatively small population and I think made it have a bit more, influence than what might have been initially assumed. Something that was fairly unique for Georgia was that the Republic had ethnic Georgian leadership. And here I'm talking, first secretary of the party, head of the Sovnarkom, for the entire 70-year period. And this is pretty unusual. You don't have the Russians or the Slavs, running the show politically in terms of the Georgian party. And that is quite unusual compared, even to other areas in the Caucasus, not to mention Central Asia or even Ukraine. So somewhat as a sub point of that, Georgia throughout had disproportionately Georgian party membership, higher education levels. The linguistic Russification was much less successful in Georgia than in other parts of the Soviet Union among ethnic Georgians. So these are just kind of some of the sort of census-based factors, which of course, are not objectively true necessarily, but it's what we have to work with in terms of the data that I think help to kind of put Georgia and Georgians in context. And then, of course, the key figures of Soviet Georgia are well known to all, I think, at this point, but worth recalling, not just Stalin, but also Beria, Sergei Orджоникидзе, of course, of the sort of old Bolshevik generation, and of course, Edward Shevardnadze. These are the figures that loom large in the political narrative, not just of Georgia, but also of Soviet history. And I think, what's perhaps interesting for my book is that it's kind of the period between when Stalin and Beria are, in Moscow as union-wide decision makers, ending, of course, in the early 50s, and when Shevardnadze becomes Soviet foreign minister in 1985. That's really a period when, I argue, is extremely formative for Georgia and for Georgian nation building, but it's precisely when there was not this perceived, Georgian political patron in Moscow to which Georgians could appeal. So nation building Soviet style. As I alluded to earlier, the Soviet Union had a very deliberate, explicit, and ideologically motivated reason for constructing nationalities. Over time, of course, what Yuri Sloskin has called ethnophilia of the 20s and early 30s ended up narrowing a bit into support just as deep for a smaller number of developed nationalities over time, of which groups like Georgians or republic level nationalities ended up being the real beneficiaries of that sort of narrowing of support. And these instruments or institutions of nation building included a wide array of tools, including support for refined and narrowed census nationality categories, languages, clearly demarcating territory and borders, devoting a lot of resources to writing national histories and creating national canons, whether this is, promoting a national poet or celebrating a particular artist or theater history or things of that sort. Plus, I think the more kind of traditional party view of things, such as is making the nomenclatura, the party membership, more ethnic in nature from the republic that they are purported to represent. And then, of course, there's a darker side to this toolkit as well that I devote a chapter or more to in the book. This is the deportation, expulsions, internal forced resettlements that kind of I think are, of course, well known to the image of the Soviet Union under Stalin, but it's something that I think, in my book, I'm looking at much more in a post-war sense rather than as a byproduct or sort of ancillary story to the terror and to the kind of pre-World War II period. But that's something that continues thereafter as well, and certainly had a mark on the Soviet ethno-territorial map and nation building policies. And then finally, the broader efforts to nationalize not just a republic, make it more homogenous in the name of the nationality for whom the republic was named, and then also the capital. So this is something that's not limited to Georgia. We're seeing it, certainly in the case of Baku, even cities in Ukraine, in the Baltics, et cetera, in the post-war period. But just as a desire for greater ethnic homogeneity and kind of dominance of capitals and of republics by the nationalities for whom they are named. And so Georgians, but not only Georgians, use these tools, and in many cases went beyond them, and I think that's a key point, to pursue and claim their national rights as they understood them in the Soviet period. And so this brings me to what I think is maybe the major analytical intervention that I try to make in the book, and that is introducing a concept that I call entitled nationhood. And so this really came from a discomfort I'd had for a long time with the terminology of titularity. I think in our narrow field of Russian and Soviet area studies, we knew what titular nationalities meant: Armenians in the Armenian SSR, Georgians in Georgian SSR, et cetera. But I found that term to be kind of limiting in two ways. First of all, I felt like only people in sort of the Soviet field could understand what we were talking about, number one. So it was harder to sort of connect with people working, in other parts of the globe or other parts of history for that matter. But secondly, I felt like it was a little bit, static and descriptive, and passive, perhaps, is the better word. And the protagonists or the voices that I was encountering in the archives were anything but passive in terms of how they were trying to engage with these Soviet institutions of nation building. So I was looking for a way to describe Georgians in the Georgian SSR that would capture a bit more agency, I suppose, in terms of how they were negotiating these terms of nationhood through the Soviet state. And so entitled nationhood is my attempt at that, is that new terminology. I don't seek to limit it to the Georgian case, but of course my book is devoted to the Georgian case. So that's what I'm focusing on. And here I'm really trying to use it to embrace both the statistical and legal implications of living in one's own territory, which by design, these groups are endowed with special rights and privileges. This was enshrined in Soviet law. It was renegotiated at various points, according to the subsequent Soviet constitutions that were put into place. But it's something, and I think this is important, it didn't just exist in theory and on paper. It's something that Soviet citizens in Georgia demanded in practice. And of course, with varying degrees of success, but it's something that over time, they were trying to actually, appeal to the state in order to get. And in some cases that did work and shows the sort of malleability or flexibility of these Soviet institutions of nation building. We see across the Stalin divide, so kind of pre and post 1956, a shift as well from these demands of entitled nationalities, moving from kind of an elite phenomenon to one of, I guess more of a grassroots or civic phenomenon. In the Stalin period, this was really the sort of purview of the political and intellectual elite among Georgians, I would say. We see this in territorial irredentist campaigns, and some of the efforts to write a national history, and certainly some of the very extensive language politics of the 30s and 40s, and efforts to redraw borders and that sort of thing. But it really being an elite pursuit to one, I think in the mid 50s and thereafter, to being something where, ordinary citizens, more or less, not just limited to Tbilisi, not just the sort of urban intelligentsia, taking to the streets or, writing letters, appealing in other ways to Soviet rights as they understood them in the Soviet Constitution or in, Marxist-Leninist theory, and insisting that their rights as Georgians in Georgia, needed to be upheld or in some cases, perhaps expanded. So this created, what really is a fairly, rigid and ambitious republic level hierarchy of rights that could be claimed and in some cases tested over time, creating by, the 60s or 70s, really a hegemony of the entitled nationality in Georgia. And you see this, in the development of Tbilisi and its urban history. You see it in moments of political mobilization and demonstration, as well as in moments of tension, for example, between Tbilisi and ethnic Georgians and leaders in Abkhazia, really over the course of the post-war period. Of course, for all of the entitled rights that are claimed, this is going to have an impact on non-entitled groups in the Republic, of which there are many, and not just groups that could perhaps appeal to, kin nationalities, be they next door or elsewhere in the USSR. But of course, there are other groups as well who perhaps did not have diasporic groups, perhaps to which they could appeal elsewhere in the Union. And I referred to this earlier as well, but Georgia could, and Georgians, I think, at various points could, on the one hand, have developed this sense of hegemony within Georgia, again by design. But at various points also adopt a position of situational minorityhood, certainly within the Union, at various points, for example, after 1956, viewing the crackdown as a Russian versus Georgian moment, and being viewed as imperial victims of Russia, for example. Or to take a very different example, there were in many of the border regions, for example, near Armenia or Azerbaijan, or even in a place like Sukhumi, where it's a much more multi-ethnic environment or an environment that perhaps has, a much higher proportion of either Armenian residents or Azerbaijani residents, where locally Georgians are very much in the minority, but are trying to, again, kind of claim their rights as they understood them in the majority against some of those local forces. So it's a complicated picture, but this is what I'm trying to do with this entitled nationhood concept, and would be interested in any thoughts on that. Next slide. So my book covers a fairly long timeline, focusing mostly on the 1945 to 1989 period, but have to give a little bit of background for the 20s and 30s. But I think just to run through very quickly what some of the key post-war events and developments that I cover in various chapters. And I'm happy to go into more detail on any of these in the discussion component. But these include things as wide-ranging as territorial irredentist campaigns vis-a-vis Azerbaijan, Turkey, and Iran in the kind of early Cold War period, but also running up, even into the 60s and 70s. Internal resettlements and deportations, expulsions of prominent minority populations. Again, this was a post-war phenomenon, really going from 1944 through 1951 in Georgia, and affecting a wide range of minority populations, as well as certain groups of Georgians as well. Moments of significant demonstration and unrest, as well as policy response in 1956, in 1977 and 78, around the new Brezhnev constitution and some proposed language changes that were attempted, but ultimately failed in the case of Georgia. And then in 1989, regarding the status of Abkhazia as it moved toward declaring independence. In the 1960s and 70s, looking at Georgia really as the capital of the Soviet second economy, and sort of what the post-1956 compromise that Moscow and Tbilisi ended up striking in exchange for the local political leaders, not letting something to the extent of what happened in 1956 happen again. And that was really a much more hands-off policy pursued by Moscow vis-a-vis Georgia. And it allowed for things like, the second economy, as well as some very interesting moments of, cultural, economic, and other experimentation to happen in that window. Interethnic relations, as I said, have the Georgian Abkhaz sort of dynamic chronicled at various points in the book. But I think this is the sort of broader dynamic of entitled and non-entitled nationalities over the course of the Soviet Georgian experiment is something that does run throughout the book. And then finally, the growth and Georgification of Tbilisi. So Tbilisi, Georgia's capital, only became a majority Georgian city in the early 1970s. And so, this is very much a Soviet story. And so I chronicle one Soviet neighborhood in particular as sort of a, microcosm of this broader process of nation building through Soviet institutions. Which brings us again to Stalin. And the Stalin factor, of course, is one that remains quite contested. He, of course, in some ways is Georgia's native son, but of course, publicly and really as he moved up the ranks of Bolshevik politics, disavowed his Georgian past for the most part, at least publicly, and embraced much more a, Russianized, super nationalist, I suppose, as he rose to power in Moscow. That didn't mean that he didn't speak Georgian in private, didn't mean that he, did not surround himself in many cases with people who, were either from the Caucasus or made their career in the Caucasus. But, officially, Stalin was the leader of the Soviet Union, this new power, and put on a Russian guise, in that effort. There's the public Stalin and the private Stalin, and this is something that I think does change over time. We see this as well in the construction of the Moscow base, but also the global cult of Stalin, beginning in the 30s. And that was what was officially attempted to be dismantled in 1956. Georgia, of course, developed, I think, in a more grassroots fashion, a more nationalized and localized cult of Stalin that had a more uneven trajectory in terms of being dismantled after Stalin's death. And that's something that I think continues to have afterlives in Georgian politics today. But you know, it was more national. I think it was less based on you know, some of the things that we see, for instance, in ways that Stalin is commemorated in Russia today. But it also can be a bit more unpredictable in how it has evolved, you know, really over the past 70 years or so. Stalin's network. I think this is very much not just about Stalin, the individual, but about the network he built. These kind of Caucasians in the Kremlin, as well as at home, that were so influential in, on the one hand, keeping him and the broader sort of apparatus connected to events in Georgia and in the Caucasus more broadly, but also the extent to which that was successfully unraveled or not after Stalin's death and after de-Stalinization. We see in Stalin's lifetime, and I talk about this some in the first couple of chapters of the book, what Stalin's patronage of certain aspects of Georgian nation building looked like, whether it was from, you know, line editing national histories to promoting a cult of Rustaveli, which is sort of, you know, Georgia's famous medieval lyric poet, Georgia's Pushkin, though of course predated Pushkin by several centuries. Editing screenplays for Georgian films in the height of World War II, you know, things like that, that clearly showed an outsized desire to weigh in on how this national sort of narrative was being crafted at points, at least in terms of geopolitics or high politics in Moscow. It seemed a bit surprising that he would decide to weigh in when he did. And again, kind of what that meant for his counterparts in Georgia proper. And then finally, this sort of gap temporally between Stalin and Shepard Mao Tse, when there are so many, I think, dynamic and unusual things happening in Georgia, but precisely in this period when there was perceived to have been a lack of a Georgian, you know, countryman or patron, you know, in Moscow in the Politburo in the same fashion. And so I will conclude here just with a couple of thoughts on Stalin and Georgian nationhood more in a more contemporary fashion. So, you know, the ghost of Stalin and the Stalin cult, I think, are alive and well in Georgia today. Officially, Stalin, of course, has been erased from the landscape, including, I think, most directly in a law from 2010 called the Liberty Charter, which removed Soviet and Nazi symbols, though I don't really think there were any, from official buildings in Georgia. But that doesn't mean that individuals can't, I think, continue to construct, you know, a Stalin monument on private property. The very infamous Stalin Museum in Gori continues to exist much in the same way it has for, I mean, really since the 30s, really being a site of interest for tourists, but patronage as well for those who, and pilgrimage for those who, you know, do continue to revere Stalin, you know, as a famous Georgian or otherwise. And in Georgian politics, I think, as people know well now, given the events of the last couple of weeks, you know, Stalin is frequently invoked, I think, as a foil or as, you know, a specter by various political forces in Georgia. And so the picture I have on this slide is actually from a decade ago. And for those of you who might not recognize all of the figures, this was, you know, on the side of a building in downtown Tbilisi from early 2013. This was not long after the Georgian Dream political movement had won parliamentary elections, and there was a brief window when, you know, we had the prime minister from Georgian Dream, President Mikhail Saakashvili, was still in office, so there was kind of a weird overlap period there where politically was quite contentious, but. These, you know, Soviet nesting dolls, shall we say, have Stalin, of course, Putin in the middle, and then Bidzina Ivanishvili, who is the founder of the Georgian Dream political movement, was prime minister, you know, right after the election, and then officially removed himself from politics. He's a billionaire. He's by far the most wealthy person in Georgia, has no official role, but is widely considered to be, you know, a decisive political force, you know, for Georgian Dream, shall we say. So needless to say, I think the specter of Stalin, the specter of Russian influence and that sort of thing is something that can be levied by many sides in Georgian political discourse today. Not to mention, on the streets of Tbilisi or elsewhere in the country. So with that, I will conclude and look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you, Claire. If you unshare your screen, we might have in detail the gallery view and all of that. I fear there's many things I could ask and a few notes I was taking and all of that, but there's lots of nice people on the screen. So as Sasha Spitalnik has just posted in the chat, there's lots of ways to engage. You could either put up your hand, open up the, pose a question in the chat if you'd prefer me to read it out, but why don't we start with Ivan and we'll take it from there. Please, Ivan.
Oh, well, thank you. This is such a timely project. So this is great. Now, in the post-war period that you mentioned of the mass deportation of minorities in Georgia, of course, the US was doing something really similar in Central Europe. So just curious, at the time, how were these mass deportations viewed? Because of course, today we view them as abhorrent, but what did they think about them back then?
So I think the Central European comparison is extremely important, in terms of looking at Stalin's, population exchanges, maybe to put a different terminology on it between Poland and Ukraine, of course, the mass expulsion of Germans, et cetera. I think looking at this in that moment in time, I think is enormously important. And it wasn't limited to Georgia. I think that the operations that took place in Georgia were a mix of things that were both in Georgia as well as the broader kind of Black Sea littoral. And then, of course, there were operations in Armenia and Azerbaijan as well, kind of between those two republics. But I think something that is a bit different in the case of the Caucasus and Georgia specifically, looking at, I look at, for example, the deportation of the Meskhetians in 1944, which of course is a bit different because it was in 1944, not 1946 or something. But those tend to get lumped in with the deportation of the Crimean Tatars, for instance, just because they were happening, kind of in the same period. But the important thing, I think, for Georgia is that this was never occupied by Germany or Romania. And so the sort of charge of, they were collaborating with the Nazis, therefore, even as thinly, veiled as that accusation was with regard to populations in the North Caucasus, still, troops were there in the midst and did occupy parts of that region. The same cannot be said of Georgia. And so I think the World War II based security imperative for these operations in the case of the South Caucasus, just doesn't really work in the same way that, of course, people have argued was the case for the Baltics, for Ukraine, et cetera, right? That these were collaborators and therefore they deserve to be punished. Again, that in itself is an extremely problematic accusation, but it really doesn't work in the case of Georgia. And then secondly, I think, so in the case of the Meskhetians, the sort of justification for the operation, and again, they started planning this, pretty far in advance in spring, and it was in a November operation in 1944. It's really not couched in a World War II sort of security imperative. It's very much looking at Turkey and almost like presaging the Cold War in some ways, which is kind of fascinating, if disturbing. And that was very much how Berry and others justified it. And we see similar, scare tactics, I would say, for the second big group of operations that I look at, which were in 1949. And those targeted a mix of, they targeted Turks, they targeted Greeks. Again, given the sort of unfolding early Cold War constellation, that kind of makes sense in that environment. If you're, a Soviet official, but it also targeted Dashnaks / Armenians. And so as just a political category, but I think in all cases, I think for Meskhetians as well as for groups that were swept up in this 1949 operation, which are tens of thousands of people, which is a lot in a republic the size of Georgia. none of them really knew why they were being deported. And it wasn't limited to a specific locale. It was Tbilisi, it was Abkhazia, it was Southern Georgia, it was everywhere. And they weren't wholesale, but it was, large enough to change the demographic makeup. And I think, that's what was so confusing from the perspective of the expellees was like, we are Soviet citizens. We actually, in some cases, for Armenians, fled to Russia / the Soviet Union to escape Turkish oppression, to escape the genocide and that sort of thing. And this was what they got in return. And they're explicitly, invoking some of these, moments of confusion, as they're being deported to Central Asia. And so I think that's an important, maybe distinction for the Georgian case. And the final sort of batch of deportations I look at are associated with the Mingrelian affair in 1951. And so, I think the sort of, this was basically an effort by Stalin to cut off Beria's local network, patronage network, without attacking Beria, himself. So we hear, I think, about the high politics element of this, but what is not known as I think publicly is that about 11,000, I think, people were deported from Georgia as part of this as well to Central Asia. They, in I think most cases, probably would have had Georgian listed on their passport nationality, but were sort of, accused of being collaborators with Turks or, disloyal in some fashion. So, you see both, I think, an effort to kind of target some of these new Cold War enemies, I guess, and the diaspora is attached to them, but also try to edit a bit the contours of who politically could be, in the post-war Soviet Georgia, through these methods of excision. Some of these groups were able to return to Georgia, but not all. I think the Meskhetians being the most famous example. I think technically they still aren't allowed to come back, but others have had a bit more success in getting back to Georgia proper.
Claire, just as a follow-up before anyone else asks anything, is it fair to remember with the Ahisko, with the Meskhetians, that was there some sense that part of the motive for the deportation was that some officials felt that it would please higher ups to take care of them in some way? Like, I mean, that's the great, your archival work was the only time I ever got, and I'm not trying to set you up, to say this is what you said strongly, but the archival work that you found was the only time I ever found any possible logic that people were that lower level officials were literally almost sacrificing and offering up the Meskhetians as some performative gesture to say, hey, we know how to cleanse, we know how to get things done, we know how to, it still remains one of the biggest mysteries of the post-war period.
And yes, and in going kind of above and beyond what was asked of them. Absolutely. Because it doesn't fit the rationale otherwise for deportations at that time. Meskhetians within the sort of Georgian ethno-territorial map. Again, it's an odd choice. And initially, the plan was to resettle them within Georgia, just further away from the border region. Clearly, that's not what happened. And I think, the total number deported was like 90,000 or something. It was quite high. And then, more loyal Georgians from the mountains were resettled in those southern regions, to collectivize accordingly.
Okay. Other questions, please, unless Ivan, you want to follow up, please.
Well, it's not a follow-up, but thank you so much for your wonderful answer. I'm so looking forward to getting your book. Now, nationalism it's been so tricky for us to theoretically really nail down, and I'm interested in your theory here. Could you tell me like what were some of the previous works on the theory of nationalism that you drew on, like maybe Benedict Anderson, Craig Calhoun?
Great question. I actually think as I was in the various stages of this project, the book that I kept coming back to was Rogers Brubaker's Nationalism Reframed. Just, looking at the constitutive capacity of institutions and, the sort of peculiar elements of what the Soviet Union was actually trying to do. You know, I just found that analytically to be extremely helpful. You know, I don't think he devotes a ton of space to Georgia specifically, but that's one that, you know, I found at various points to just kind of, you know, be worth coming back to. You know, I think having to kind of grapple, of course, with Benedict Anderson, with the sort of classics, right, Miroslav Hrok and others, right, the various stages of national development and that sort of thing. You know, I think that's an important context to have in mind too. But I think for me, something that felt important, I don't know if I entirely succeeded in it, but this was a difference, I guess, in dissertation versus book, was I felt like the nationalism conversation and somehow marrying that with the empire conversation, you know, was worth doing, and one that wasn't necessarily, you know, obvious or easy. You know, that was, I think, again, analytically kind of one of the big differences in the book compared to what I was doing, you know, in the early stages of the dissertation.
Great, please. We have a question from Yelena, please.
Thank you very much for the talk, and I've already ordered the book. It's waiting for me in the library. So I'm really looking forward to reading it in more detail. I have a comment and then a question. So I'm a scholar of cinema, of Russian and then sort of post-Soviet space cinema, and I'm currently working on Georgian cinema. And what I found, that's a comment about your commentary on how the asserting the national identity moved from sort of more of a elite levels to more grassroots levels, because there was a whole discussion in the sort of the major cinema for major journal for Soviet cinema, Искусство кино, the art of cinema, about devoted specifically to Georgian cinema and the critique of Georgians in sort of losing the touch with the viewers, to which actually the Georgian filmmakers and critics responded, and they defended their position. And they specifically placed the emphasis on how Georgian poetic cinema, that's been known for its parable-like narratives and tragicomedy and comedies, how it's actually in the spirit and historically grounded in Georgian culture. So they were making this claim that their use of kind of avoidance in a way of censorship and assertion of their national identity beyond, you know, the national in form and socialist in content is actually legitimate because it's a part of their national history and national culture. So, you know, I really liked how you sort of theorized that, and it gave support to my observations. But the question that I have, you know, writing about Georgian cinema, and I previously worked on Kazakh and Kazakhstani cinema, and I'm facing, particularly in post-Soviet era, I'm facing this problem, like, what is Kazakh and what is Kazakhstani? And Terry Martin, in his Affirmative Action Empire, quotes Stalin as saying that, you know, he believed that Georgians are equally imperialists, like they have equally imperial mentality like Russians do, except that it's kind of within Georgia where they sort of dominate and suppress the national minorities. And therefore he felt it was important that the national minorities have autonomy, right? Autonomous status. And so from a post-Soviet perspective, when we analyze these imperial attitudes, how do we negotiate these attitudes within the newly independent states, like Kazakh and Kazakhstani, right? Not every Kazakhstani film is necessarily made by an ethnic Kazakh. How do we make a similar distinction within Georgia? Is it fair to speak about Georgian history? Because it goes back into ancient times, but when we speak about Georgian history, right, the Georgian winemaking tradition or Georgian cinema, how do we tackle the kind of multi-ethnic composition of a country that is named after its dominant ethnicity? And of course, in Georgian, it's Sakartvelos, you know, but it's named after the dominant ethnicity. How do we then talk about Georgian history, for example?
A lot there to unpack, but I'm glad to hear that you're working on, the Georgian cinema, which, for those of you who are not aware, I mean, it is just a treasure trove of truly amazing, cultural products. And the period that I'm focusing on in my book, I think, is particularly a golden age of cinema generally, but of Georgian, contributions to it. So would highly recommend people to go out and, not just watch Repentance, but look at some of the other films as well, because they're really, really amazing. So in terms of the kind of, imperial versus national tension, I suppose, your Stalin quote reminded me also that I think Andrei Sakharov described Georgia in the same way, at the close of the Soviet period, this sort of charge of Georgians as being, like local imperialists, I suppose. This is something that Stalin and Lenin debated quite heavily as the Soviet Union was coming into being in the early 20s. And rather than great Russian chauvinism, being the real danger locally, Stalin and Orджonikidze, to some extent, were really making the argument that great Russian chauvinism was not the cause for concern in the Caucasus. It was great power chauvinism, by which they, of course, meant Georgians and Armenians against everybody else. And so, that's some of the reason why I think the map in the Caucasus was as complicated and convoluted as it was. And that's also why you see, in the early Soviet period, with the Georgian affair of 1922, and the subsequent way in which the Caucasus was brought into the Soviet Union in 1923. This was a pretty elaborate political negotiation between Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan on the one hand, the new Soviet power in Moscow on the other, to make some, I guess, concessions toward national autonomy in some cases, but also make sure that they were, politically on the same playing field as other entities that came into the Soviet Union. And so you see some of those then, those charges and debates resurfacing again, I think, as the Soviet Union collapses and continuing today. I think Georgian narratives of Georgian history, of course, tend to kind of double down on a single Georgian, history, language, ethnic group, et cetera, as if that had existed, somewhat without any sort of change over time. And again, this is for, a language that's existed since, a written language that's existed since the 4th century, a church that's existed since the 4th century, a history of statehood that they claim, at various points, 1,000 years ago, and other points. Armenia, I think, is engaged in a sort of similar trajectory backwards. But I think that kind of ignores the work that was happening in the 19th century and in the 20th century, kind of during the era of modern nationalism. And then, of course, the Soviet variant of that. I talk about this a bit in my first chapter. After you write a book, you kind of forget what order things appeared in. My first chapter, the consolidation of census nationality categories in the case of Georgians. And so in the 1926 census, which was the first all-union census in the Soviet Union, there were a few different Georgian Kartvelian categories. There were Svan, Mingrelian, Laz, Ajaran, and Georgian. And so between the 26 and 37/39 censuses, you go from having that sort of multiplicity of Kartvelian categories to a single Georgian nationality category. And that was something that, Georgian political elites lobbied pretty hard against Moscow for, including Beria, to make the case that these were all Georgians. There was one Georgian language. We shouldn't dilute ourselves even further, in official statistics by, having Mingrelians and Laz and Swan being their own groups. And so, they're not the only ones doing this in terms of assimilation and consolidation of ethnic and linguistic categories through Soviet censuses. But I think it kind of gets at the, really modern aspects of nation building and institutional aspects of it that, of course, get left out when we're talking about the sort of, unbroken national history with its various golden ages that tend to get projected, I think, backwards from official sources now.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments, please?
Vaksanki Babidze, indeed.
Claire, is it fair, just while we're here in a moment, I mean, I think the question I always love to ask people is what were among the dissatisfactions that motivated them to take up a project? You've been doing this for a while, and I think you already laid that out pretty well in your book, but is it fair to say, in the presentation that you gave us, but is it fair to say that you were frustrated that people were somehow not taking the Soviet period seriously enough and assuming there was this kind of binary opposition between Georgians and Russians that didn't involve Georgians in the machinations of the post-war period in ways that, I mean, that to me is one of the big values of the book, but I don't know if that was really, if that's what you put at the forefront of what you really want to be doing here.
No, it is. And you have that captured maybe more elegantly than I did in the book. A dissatisfaction, I think, with, really this period, in the post-war, the post-Stalin period. I think this sort of assumption that, things didn't really change on the national front between Stalin and Gorbachev, so to speak. And should that even be the frame of reference, to be honest, because the political change in Moscow didn't always necessarily have the same significance, at the republic level that maybe, the sort of grand narrative of Soviet history, assumes. So I think it was this assumption that, at the level of Tbilisi or any kind of non-Russian republic, the post-war period was not a place of a site of change and a site of, in this case, some really unusual and surprising things that definitely complicate a view of this period of, it being stagnation, it being, people not buying into the Soviet experiment and not trying to use it in ways to advance national interests. And that's really, I think, the crux of the book.
Please. We also have a question from Sean, please.
I just got 3 real brief questions. I spent last summer in Tbilisi actually learning or improving my Russian language skills. But anyway, did you do your research in Georgian, or can you read Georgian and stuff, or did you have to go another?
I learned Georgian in order to do the project, but the sources were a mix of Georgian and Russian. And I think that's just sort of a reality of how Soviet archives for Georgia, but also I think more generally in the sort of non-Russian republics of the Soviet Union tended to operate. So in my experience, just I think if it's of interest or use to others, Georgia was a great place to do archival research, number one. Highly recommend it, even if maybe it's not quite as open as it was 10 years ago. Those were really wonderful, ideal research conditions for me. But I think you see a change over time in terms of which languages are being used in the archives, as well as institutionally, there's some sort of rules of the road. So if it's the economy, if it's security services, most things were in Russian, just for kind of obvious reasons, given what we know about how the Soviet Union worked. But over time, and especially kind of from the 50s onward, everything else was increasingly done in Georgian, in terms of the archival trail. And so since I was looking at things related to, national identity and culture and education and reading a lot of petitions and letters and things like that, had I not known Georgian, it would not have been possible to do it. And so as I started to conceive of this project, getting a research proficiency in Georgian was task number one, basically. And unfortunately, it's pretty hard to learn Georgian in the US. Just institutionally, there aren't really like any universities that teach it. So had to do a combination of intensive research or study in Georgian or in Georgia. And then I think was probably one of the early adopters of like Skype lessons in Georgian in between.
Thank you. That kind of covered like one of my other questions about how you acquired it. But when you were looking at your book, which I'm a little one step ahead of Yvonne and somebody else. I actually got the book. I haven't read it yet, though, so I'm only barely ahead of them. Did you come across any nationalist or opposition groups that were active in Georgia against the Soviet regime?
Certainly two individuals that I think most people will have heard of, and that is the first president of Georgia, Zviad Gamsakhuria, and his close colleague and confidant Merab Kostava, who was killed kind of before Zviad came to power. But anyway, they were kind of the two most high-profile Georgian dissidents. But their, as they told it, formative experience was on the streets in March 1956. They were, I think, 15 or something, teenagers there, along with everyone else. That was a real shock for them. But unlike the vast majority of their compatriots, their response to those events was to, look for, more of a what would become a dissident path, as opposed to kind of reevaluating what the system could do for them and adapting accordingly, which is kind of how most ended up responding to that shift that happened in 1956. Gamsakhuria becomes the first president of Georgia after Georgia declared independence, but came from a very prominent Georgian intellectual family. His father was a very well-known, writer, kind of in the Stalin era, Konstantin Gamsakhuria. So that afforded Zviad both, I think, cultural status, intellectual status, et cetera, and also a bit of protection from the authorities too. So he, at various points, in the 70s, very famously, he and Kostava got the Georgia Helsinki group up and running. Looking at what others in the Soviet Union did in Moscow and elsewhere after the 1975 Helsinki Accords, and had a kind of complicated dance with the Georgian security services as well as those of the All Union. He has a very bizarre televised forced confession where he disavows his his underground activities, et cetera, that I think caused him to lose a lot of credibility with his small cohort of followers, et cetera. But they move from being very, very much on the fringe, really, in the 70s and most of the 80s, to then in 1989 really being propelled to the forefront of a rapidly changing political scene. So I think, as was the case elsewhere in the collapsing Soviet Union, you have fringe figures who maybe are coming from the intelligentsia or other groups being thrust into positions of power and decision making, fairly unprepared for those types of things. But I think the Zviad period is not really regarded very fondly in Georgia, and that's probably interesting.
Thank you very much for the very interesting talk, and I look forward to reading your book and learning even more. Thank you.
Please, any other comments or questions? Well, Claire, look, I'm not going to press people, but I'm just going to ask one last thing, which is you've done this book, it hasn't been out a long time, but it's been out, a while, and you have started to get some feedback. Are there things that you most would like people to take from this book? Or that you're struck that maybe people are reading it for other reasons and you want to remind them why you wrote it?
And I've had very different questions, I think, with each talk that I've given. And so I think, for me, what I would like the takeaway to be is really that it's important to look more closely at the post-war period. And, I see Georgia as one of probably several different, trajectories or examples there. I would love to see a similar book written about Kazakhstan and about, Ukraine and Estonia and Uzbekistan, because I think that, there's going to be a variety or a spectrum of national experiences there, as in most cases, Moscow kind of backs off for various reasons in that window of, whether it's late Khrushchev or Brezhnev, period, et cetera. And I think that allows for some interesting variance in what we assume to be kind of the typical Soviet story. And so I think that there's a lot of good work there to be, be done. And so I hope that my my book can kind of be the Georgian, element of that.
Well, I know just before we give the floor back to Yvonne briefly, that I will say though, that I really want to give praise where praise is due though, that this, it would be very difficult to do this book in Azerbaijan.
Yeah, I know.
Very, very difficult. And I'm glad that you did it in Georgia, in a place where people are really responsive to the post-colonial questions and questions of engagement under difficult political situations. But, look at the experience that our colleague Krista Goff had recently won the Dan David Prize for her great work including her book, the one that recently came out on the post-war period. But the reaction there was actually pretty hostile. And so I think it's just really terrific that you've done this so well that, people are responding to it positively.
And I have had good reception, initially from people in Georgia as well as Georgians outside of Georgia. And so I've been, very happy to have Georgians, at all of my talks and it stimulated some very interesting questions there. And there's a Georgian translation in the works, which I'm really excited about too.
We have a last question, I think, from Yvonne then. Sorry, please.
Yeah, so as you were, well, one of my big problems whenever I'm writing a history is knowing when to stop. I mean, I keep going back and back and back until I'm writing about the dinosaurs, right? But what this talker just reminded me of was Fritz Fischer's work, Germany's War Aims. And I just brought it up on my computer here and saw that there were 60,000 Germans near Tbilisi, which is amazing to me. I was wondering if you looked into the foreign influence on German nationalism during this period, because there's, Russia sure has been making the claim that, all the colored revolutions and the current Ukrainian nationalist movement is being essentially funded by the West.
So foreign influence on current Georgian nationalism? That's the question?
No, not on current one. I'm just saying that that's interesting current context. But in even before the First World War and right afterwards, that Germany was trying to influence the politics within Georgia and trying to drive and support a nationalist movement there. I was wondering if you looked at that.
Yeah, no, the sort of German, British, and Turkish efforts to play, I think, Caucasus politics in that World War I, era are none of them, were successful, but very, very bizarre and interesting moments in history, I think. And I actually, I need to read and review a book on that precise German angle that a Georgian scholar just wrote. So maybe I'll get back to you in a few months on that. But I think more generally, the sort of Georgian intellectual engagement with a modern conception of nationalism and nationhood, is something that's deeply tied to, European discourses and traditions, starting from the 1860s or so. These are people who are reading European journals, really seeing themselves kind of on the European map, but mediated through, the Russian Empire, of course. That's how they're viewing the world, and Georgians' place in it, is the Russian imperial frame that was Georgians' access to Europe intellectually, culturally, et cetera. So I think divorcing the Georgian experience from that broader sort of history of ideas, wouldn't really be honest. Not to mention, the Georgian engagement with social democracy and Georgian Marxists. That was the real triumph of the Democratic Republic of Georgia, right? Was a democratically elected, genuine social democracy that I think was national kind of by default, as opposed to kind of as a centerpiece of their program. So the other nationalities left them and pursued, different political paths in Bolshevism or elsewhere. And so what they were left with was, a Georgian political movement, but it certainly didn't start out that way, and allowed for them to, have an interesting significance, I think, in the world of Menshevism for a bit there, in the late teens, early 20s.
An hour and a quarter in, I just want to thank a very kind group for joining us. It's really a terrific piece of work, but it's also obviously a launchpad for a lot of other questions about not just the late Soviet 20th century, but the kind of, where Claire ended us with about how this is going to inform post-Soviet dimensions today and the kinds of things we're seeing in very fraught Georgian politics. So Claire Claire, you got us going. Thank you for this great work, and we'll look forward to seeing everyone at the next round.
Well, thanks, Bruce. Thanks, Sasha, and thanks everyone for coming and for your really interesting questions.